In the silent forest, blanketed by snow, a deaf girl lies beside the lifeless body of the dog who died protecting her from an unseen killer. No cries, no rescue. But in that moment of utter hopelessness, something unexplainable happened. This isn't a fairy tale, it's the cost of loyalty and spilled blood wrapped in silence. Before we begin, hit subscribe so you won't miss any of our emotional and suspense-filled storytelling films. The screen is blank white, endless, deafening in its silence. The wind howls before the image fades in. Snow whips across the camera like shards of frozen glass. The forest is buried beneath thick blankets of white trees stripped to skeletal silhouettes, and visibility is barely a few feet. Then, out of the haze, a tiny figure emerges. She moves slowly, dragging one booted foot while the other stumbles. Her name is Amy Rivers. She is 6 years old and profoundly deaf. Her cheeks are flushed raw, lips purple, and her mittens soaked through. A cracked plastic flashlight dangles uselessly from her small hand. Its bulb dark, its battery long dead. She doesn't cry. Not because she isn't scared, but because she knows no one will hear her, not even herself. Her breath comes in frantic puffs, but no sound escapes her throat. The only noise is the wind. That, and the crunch of her small feet pressing into snowdrifts too deep for her weight. The camera closes in on her face, eyes wide, trembling, but blank in a way no child's eyes should ever be. She glances around as if sensing movement, but the forest only offers silence. Flash, darkness, inside a van. The roar of the storm is muffled by the thick metal walls. The van speeds along a remote mountain road, chains rattling on the tires. The headlights pierce through swirling snow, but barely. Inside, the air is stale, stinking of gasoline, cigarettes, and fear. A woman grips the steering wheel tight. Her name is unknown, but her face is harshly lit by the green dashboard glow. Mid-30s, smudged eyeliner. Her eyes flick to the rearview mirror. Behind her, Amy sits curled in a pile of clothes in the cargo area. She clutches her flashlight like a relic. She's watching the woman with a fragile hope, the kind a child keeps long after it should have broken. Next to the woman, a man leans forward, his voice sharp and guttural. "We can't take her," he growls. "You know that. She'll get us caught." The woman doesn't answer. Her jaw tightens. "She's a liability," the man says. She doesn't talk. She doesn't listen. She can't even scream if someone grabbed her. The van hits a bump. The flashlight in Amy's hand flickers just once. "She's not ours," the man continues. "She's not even supposed to be here." The woman breathes in sharply like she wants to argue but doesn't. She looks once more in the rearview mirror. Amy is mouthing something. The woman turns away. Back to present. Amy pauses beside a tree, her knees trembling. She leans against the bark, the wind battering her side like invisible fists. Her legs give out, and she collapses into the snow. The flashlight slips from her grip. Snow falls silently, relentlessly. A small paper flutters from Amy's coat pocket. It floats in the air like ash from a long dead fire and lands beside her. It reads, "Please don't look for us. She's better off gone." The ink bleeds under melting flakes. Amy doesn't move. Another flash. The van screeches to a stop in the middle of a nowhere trail. Trees, thick sky, black road, hidden by drifts. The man climbs out first, tugging a duffel bag with him. The woman opens the side door and stares down at Amy. Amy stares back. "You're going to stay here for a while, sweetheart," the woman says, almost kindly. But her voice is hollow. The man snaps, "Just leave the damn kid." Amy doesn't understand the words, but she reads the eyes. The woman steps back. She shuts the van door. The sound is dull, cushioned by snow. The van's engine sputters, backfires, and then fades into the storm. Amy stands alone. Her hand is pressed to the van's steel as it disappears. Her fingers remain there long after the heat is gone. Now, Amy lies curled in the snow at the base of a pine tree. Her coat is too thin. Her boots are mismatched. Her breath is shallow and uneven. She clutches the flashlight again, though it remains dark. Her tiny frame is nearly hidden beneath layers of drifting snow. The camera pulls out slowly, deliberately revealing just how far into the wilderness she is. No lights, no roads, no houses. Only the pale, endless woods and the roar of the wind. Still, Amy's eyes remain open. She watches the sky, though it offers no warmth. No sign of rescue. Just endless white in the heavy silence that follows betrayal. She does not know what frostbite is, or how long hypothermia takes. She only knows cold, and hunger, and being left. In the distance, a tree groans under the weight of ice. Amy's fingers twitch once. Her body doesn't. The snow begins to cover her shoes. Flash again. The van driver flicks her cigarette out the window. The man folds a map across his knee. "She'll be gone by morning," he mutters. "Don't say that," the woman snaps. He smirks. "I'm just being realistic." The woman rubs her temple. Her hands are trembling. She trusted me. He scoffs. She's deaf. She doesn't even know what trust is. The woman flinches. She looks back once, but it's only the void. Now, Amy's lips are blue. The snow is creeping up her back. A fox darts past in the background, barely glancing at the child. Then, movement. Far off between trees, a figure. Four-legged, steady, black with streaks of gray and rust. His steps are slow but deliberate. Maverick. The old dog pauses at the edge of the clearing, eyes locked on the small bundle under the pine. He watches, waits, tilts his head. Wind howls. Amy does not move. He moves forward one paw at a time, his breath heavy. He stops just beside her, sniffs the air. Something primal stirs in him. Something buried beneath years of silence, of abandonment, of waiting for a command that would never come. He lies beside her. He doesn't bark, doesn't whimper. He presses his side into her back. Amy's fingers flinch ever so slightly. Her body leans unconsciously toward the warmth. Her eyes close. Maverick lowers his head over her shoulder and stays still motionless, except for his breath steaming in the cold. They do not speak. They do not need to. The wind screams louder now. But for the first time in hours, Amy is not alone. The camera pulls back again, revealing the vast whiteness, swallowing everything around them. A forgotten girl. A discarded dog. Wrapped together, silent, unmoving, surviving. Fade to white, then black. Title card fades in Maverick. In the silent snowfall, the forest doesn't sleep. Even beneath layers of snow, in the silence of an approaching blizzard, it breathes. Slowly, heavily. The wind whistles through bare branches like a memory forgotten but not forgiven. And somewhere within that breath, between the bone-colored trees and the fractured moonlight, a figure moves. Not a man, not a shadow. Something else. Maverick, a German shepherd coat, dark as wet ash, with streaks of rust across his shoulders, moves with ghost-like precision through the white abyss. Muscles taut, eyes scanning. He doesn't race. He glides silent, focused, and utterly alone. His paws leave prints that vanish within seconds, erased by the relentless snowfall. There is no collar on his neck, no tags jingling with domesticated hope. There is no leash dragging behind him, no human voice echoing his name. But the way he moves, deliberate with a soldier's rhythm, makes it clear this is not a stray. This is something more. He pauses at a fork in the trail. Snow flutters off a low branch, catching his flank. He doesn't flinch. He lifts his nose to the wind, sniffing deep, and something in the cold shifts. Not a sound. Not a smell. Something else. Something that triggers muscle memory deeper than command. His ears twitch. He pivots without hesitation and heads off the trail deeper into the wilderness, where no map dares to name the ridges. Flash, years ago. A field operation. Uniforms, radios crackling. Helicopters in the distance. Snow pelting like bullets. A man's voice yelling, "Maverick, go!" The dog launches forward, diving into the wreckage of a collapsed search zone. The camera shakes. The ground splits. Screams. Silence. Then nothing. The wreckage of a mountain. A handler never recovered. The unit disbanded. And Maverick presumed dead, or worse, gone rogue. Now, back in the present, Maverick cuts through the woods with a precision honed from years of training and instinct. His breath clouds the air. His eyes, though rimmed with age, gleam with sharp, unreadable focus. He doesn't know what he's tracking. Only that something fragile has fractured the air. Something wrong. There beneath a crooked pine, whose branches droop like old arms, a shape. Tiny, still, half buried. He stops at the edge of the tree line, head low. His breath comes in soft huffs as he studies the figure. It doesn't move. The snow continues to fall, covering the edges of a pink jacket that's lost its color, lost its warmth. One mitten has slipped off. Fingers tiny and pale rest on a flashlight no longer lit. Maverick takes a step closer. One, then another. The girl is curled in on herself like a question no one wants to answer. Amy Rivers. She does not tremble. Her body is past that. Her skin is porcelain under the moon, her lashes tipped with frost. She doesn't blink. Not even when he steps close enough that his breath hits her cheek. He sniffs slowly, carefully. The scent hits him like thunder. Not just the scent of a child, but abandonment, isolation, desperation. The same scent that once led him through a collapsed tunnel to pull a boy's body out from beneath concrete. The same one that brought him to the edge of a frozen lake after a mother drove her car into it. Maverick growls softly, but not at the girl. At the ghosts, the scent calls forward. Amy doesn't react. Her ears, small and untouched by the cold, cannot register sound. Her world is shaped by movement, vibration, light. None of which exist in this moment. Maverick circles her once, twice. No danger nearby. Just death, waiting. He doesn't bark. Instead, he lies down beside her. Not across from her, not a few inches away. Against her, His body presses into her back ribcage to spine, transferring what little warmth he has. Her fingers twitch. He doesn't move. He lays his head on her shoulder, his breath brushing her cheek, and watches the darkened woods. The camera doesn't move. It just holds. Amy's lips part. A single exhale leaves her mouth visible in the cold. Her face presses back into him. It is not affection. It is survival. But it is enough. Flash. An office. Voices. Someone arguing off screen. Put him down. Are you serious? He saved 3 hikers in that blizzard. He went off grid. He disappeared for 6 days. His handler is dead. You can't retrain trauma like that. Maverick sits in the corner of the room, chained, unmoving, eyes watching, waiting for a command that will never come. A final order, but it never arrives. He's gone before morning. Crate empty. No tracks. Now, the storm thickens. The forest begins to disappear behind the curtain of white. But Maverick doesn't leave. Amy shudders again. Her fingers reach up not far, just enough to touch the fur beneath his jaw. He lets her. She doesn't know who he is. She doesn't know that years ago he pulled men out of burning cabins and led medics to avalanche survivors. She only knows that she is not dead. Not yet, because of the heat pressed into her back. Because of the heartbeat she can feel through fur. Because of the stillness of the animal that has no name to her, but who has become her only shield against the dark. Time passes. The snowfall slows. The moon shifts. Amy remains tucked beneath Maverick's bulk. And he stays alert, his eyes scanning. The woods are not empty. He knows that. Predators do not always come with claws. Sometimes they wear shoes. The scene widens again. Nothing moves. Then, far in the background, a shadow slips between trees. It doesn't approach. It watches. But Maverick sees it. His eyes narrow. He doesn't growl, doesn't move. But his body tenses. Amy breathes deeper. She will wake. Later. But not yet. Now she needs the dog who has no home, no master, no orders, no voice. Only purpose. Only instinct. Only one truth. Stay. Protect. Wait. And he does, as the storm folds itself around them once more, and the night stretches on silent and brutal. A new story begins. Not with words, not with hope, but with one dog lying against one broken child in the middle of nowhere. In the heart of a forest that forgets everything, except them. The sound of an axe splitting wood cracked through the morning frost, like a wound tearing open. Ethan Walsh wiped sweat from his brow with a sleeve already stiff with old sawdust and cold air. He'd been chopping since dawn, though the woodpile by the shed already stood tall enough for 3 winters. That wasn't the point. Work was easier than remembering. The mountains around his cabin rose like old gods, indifferent, snow-veiled, and unyielding. Pines loomed over the clearing, their branches bowed with white weight, the occasional creak reminding him how even giants break under silence. Ethan stood alone in the center of it all, surrounded by his quiet kingdom of trees and regret. The morning light was fractured pale, the kind that never warms. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney behind him, the only sign of life in miles. A snowshoe hare darted between the roots of an aspen. Ethan didn't turn. His eyes were fixed on something else. Tracks. He crouched, one gloved hand brushing against the fresh snow. Too small to be deer, too light for moose. They were human, tiny, uneven. And next to them, paw prints. Large, deep, canine, his brow furrowed. He'd seen plenty of prints in these woods. Elk, bear, fox, even the occasional cougar. But this combination child and dog was wrong. No campers had filed permits. No hikers had been through since the last storm. The closest town was 4 hours away. Roads were still buried under feet of snow. Ethan stood scanning the tree-lined jaw tight. Something coiled in his chest, a rusted instinct that hadn't stirred in years. He looked down again. The child's footprints veered slightly left, like they limped or staggered. The dogs were tight against them. Protective. He exhaled slowly. Cold turned his breath to smoke. Flash. It was a different kind of snow that day. Not the quiet powder that muffled the world. This snow had teeth. Sharp, icy, relentless. He and Claire had been halfway up Bitter Ridge when the wind changed. He remembered the moment the sky collapsed, how the crack of the avalanche echoed like a gunshot in his chest. Claire had been ahead. She always liked leading. Then she was gone. The rescue crews came. Dogs, ropes, thermal scans. They found her 2 days later. Not far from where she'd stood. She'd looked peaceful, they said. But peace was a cruel thing when it came too late. Ethan had carried her body back himself. Carried it through the storm. Through the ache. Through the guilt. And then he built this cabin. Far from the world. Far from the echoes. Back. Ethan shook his head once sharply. Now wasn't the time. He grabbed his rifle from the porch. Not to use. Just habit. Protection was a reflex up here. Everything else was risk. The tracks were only a few hours old, too fresh to ignore, too quiet to explain. He followed them. Snowshoes crunched softly with each step as he left the clearing. The woods swallowed him whole. He didn't bother with markers. He knew every bend, every rise in the earth, every pine knot that looked like a face in the dark. But these tracks led somewhere unfamiliar. They followed the edge of the ridge, cut across the ravine bridge he'd rebuilt last fall, then dipped into the lowlands. Wherever they came from, they weren't heading toward civilization. They were running from something. Ethan stopped beside a frozen stream where the tracks paused. The small ones had stumbled here, dragged slightly. The dog prints doubled back, circling, waiting. Ethan crouched again, running a hand along the indentation. Children didn't just wander into these woods, not in storms, not in winter, and not alone. So who was she, and where was she now? The wind picked up shaking snow from the branches above. A flurry of ice dust fell over him like ash. He stood, eyes sweeping across the expanse. There, a break in the underbrush, a snapped twig, a faint trace of pink. He moved fast now. Breath controlled, every step calculated. His heart beat hard, not in panic, but in that old rhythm he thought he'd buried with his fire crew badge. Flash again, Claire smiling across the table. She always made pancakes too thick, said syrup was a lie made sweet. She had called him Walsh, even after the wedding. Like love needed formality. You don't need to save everything, she once told him, holding his calloused hand. Some things aren't meant to be saved. But he didn't believe that. Still didn't. He shook the memory off like snow from his shoulders. Back. The wind changed. He caught it, not sound, not scent, but presence. That shift in air when something is near. The forest tightened its breath. Ethan stepped through a curtain of snow-laced branches and froze. Ahead, maybe 50 yards half covered in snow, was a small form curled at the base of a pine. Beside her, a dog. Large, still, protective. The girl was motionless. The dog lifted its head. Their eyes met. Not aggression, not fear, recognition. Maverick didn't growl, didn't charge. He simply looked at Ethan like he'd been waiting. The man, the dog, the child. For a long second, time stopped. Only the snow moved. Ethan lowered his rifle, took a breath, and stepped forward. The wind had shifted. Snow no longer fell in gentle spirals. It whipped sideways, cutting across the trees like thrown sand. Somewhere deep in the belly of the forest, danger moved, not fast, not loud, but steady, precise, and without hesitation. Footprints half buried by fresh powder stretched across a narrow ravine. Tiny human prints. Dog tracks beside them, large and close. Behind them, barely visible, followed another set. Heavier, deeper. Boots, then more. 3 figures. Moving in staggered formation. Dressed in hunting gear, but they were no hunters. Their coats were black. Faces obscured by goggles and scarves. Only their eyes, visible eyes without emotion. One carried a thermal scanner. Another held a rifle with a suppressor, the kind used for quiet work. The third walked empty-handed, but he was the one they followed. The one who spoke. He knelt beside the prints, studied them. They're recent, he said, his voice clipped tone neutral. The dog's slowing. The girl's not walking straight. The one with the rifle shifted. You sure it's her? The leader didn't respond. Instead, he pulled a laminated photo from his coat. A young girl, eyes wide, smile forced, taken from the back seat of a car. If the dog's the one I think it is, he said, she won't make it out of here. But if she does, he didn't finish. The man with the scanner muttered, Boss, we really leaving bodies if we find them. No bodies, the leader snapped. No mess, no questions. He looked up toward the ridge. If the girl's alive, she's a liability. A loose end. You know what loose ends do? No one answered. The man smiled without warmth. They unravel. Elsewhere, Amy moved through the forest with the cautiousness of a deer learning fear for the first time. Her legs were shaking, her lips dry. The snow had seeped through the holes in her boots. Every few minutes, she slipped. Every few minutes, Maverick stopped and waited. He never barked, never looked annoyed, only glanced back with those eyes, deep aware, steady. The kind of gaze that made her feel like someone still saw her. Still cared. Her stomach growled. She hadn't eaten since before the van. She didn't know how long ago that was. She didn't count in days. She counted in footsteps. One step, another, and another. Maverick paused ahead. He sniffed the wind, then veered right away from the trail. Amy hesitated. He turned, waited. She followed. The two of them passed through a crack in the rocks, thin enough to force her sideways. The air was sharper on the other side, colder somehow. A shallow cave opened before them, tucked behind a curtain of pine. Maverick entered first, circling once, checking for danger. Amy crouched low, clutching her coat tighter, and crawled in after him. The stone was dry, sheltered. For now, she sat back against the wall, trying to make herself smaller. Maverick sat at the entrance, ears forward, listening. Amy watched him. Her breath fogged the air. She tried to mouth a word. His name, maybe? Or something like it. But her voice had long since gone quiet. Back on the trail, the pursuers had reached the edge of the ridge. The leader looked out over the slope, scanning for movement. "Tracks end here," one of them muttered. "No," the leader said. "They're hiding." He glanced toward the rocks. "Fan out, quietly." Inside the cave, Maverick lifted his nose again, then stood. Ears perked. He moved toward the opening. Stepped out. Gone for only seconds. When he returned, he dropped something at Amy's feet. She stared at it. A strip of jerky, dirty, crusted, but still edible. She blinked. Looked up at him. He nudged it toward her gently. She picked it up with trembling fingers, then tore a piece with her teeth. It was tough. Her jaw ached from chewing. But she didn't stop. Maverick lay down beside her. Close, but not pressing. Watching. Her eyes lifted to meet his. She didn't need words. Not with him. In her world, words never mattered. But presence did. She reached out hesitant and touched his shoulder. He didn't move. Outside, boots crunched snow within yards. The man with the rifle paused near the mouth of the cave. He lowered to one knee, scanned the shadows. Nothing. Just stone and ice and silence. He stood again, turned and walked away. Inside, not a sound. Amy leaned into Maverick's side, chewing slowly, feeling warmth against her cheek. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know why they followed. But the fear in her chest, quiet, sharp, told her enough. This was not rescue. These were not her people. Maverick's muscles tensed. She closed her eyes, waited for the cold to pass again. The forest shifted from white to silver as the clouds thinned, but the air remained brittle. Ethan moved with care, snowshoes gliding over the crusted surface, his breath steady and shallow. His eyes scanned the terrain not just for footprints, but for signs. Subtle things. A broken pine needle. A melted patch in the snow. The way silence sometimes bends when something is near. He'd been following the trail for over an hour now, and it no longer felt like a search. It felt like trespassing into someone else's pain. He paused near a slope where the trees grew denser. The snow was shallower here, a sign of cover, of shelter. He saw the prints again, lighter now, scattered. The girls, smaller than they should be, and the dogs still close, still circling. Protective. Ethan crouched, ran a gloved hand through the snow beside the prints. Something about their rhythm, step, pause, circle, wait, felt like code. Like a dog not just walking, but guarding. A ridge of rock rose ahead, maybe 20 yards up. A dark slit between boulders caught his eye, a natural overhang, perhaps even a shallow cave. He felt it in his chest. They were there. He didn't call out. Didn't shout hello, or it's okay. The woods weren't a place for noise, especially not when something was this fragile. Instead, he approached with measured slowness. Each step was intentional, his posture non-threatening. He held his rifle slung low across his back and raised his hands in front of him, not out of fear, but reverence. At the mouth of the cave, he stopped. He could barely make out the silhouettes, one small one still, and one watching. The eyes hit him first, amber, unblinking. Maverick. The dog rose slow but firm, like something ancient waking from a dream. Ethan froze. Maverick stepped forward from the shadows. His fur was dusted with ice, his breath forming clouds, but his body was coiled, ready. He stood between Ethan and the girl. Then he growled. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't empty. It was a warning, not just to stay back, but to stay honest. Ethan didn't move. His voice when he spoke was quiet, low enough that it might not even reach the child. Easy, boy, he said, more breath than sound. I'm not here to take her. I'm here because... He didn't finish. Words felt pointless. He removed his gloves, let them fall. Then slowly, without flinching, he lowered to one knee and held out his hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, not reaching, just waiting. Maverick didn't step forward. Not yet. Behind him, the girl moved, barely. Amy, her eyes, green-gray, like clouded glass, watched Ethan through the mess of her hair. She was hunched, arms wrapped around her knees, half hidden in shadow. Her face was blank, but her gaze was surgical. Not afraid, not trusting. Evaluating. Ethan met her eyes. He said nothing. He didn't need to. She didn't look away. Instead, her head turned slowly toward the dog. It was almost imperceptible, but the meaning was clear. She wasn't asking Ethan anything. She was asking him. Maverick turned his head back to her. Something passed between them, silent, heavy. Then, without tension, the dog took a step sideways. Then another. He moved toward Ethan, not directly, but in a curve, as if closing the space cautiously. He stopped just feet away. Still watching, still measuring. Ethan didn't break eye contact. Didn't flinch when Maverick sniffed the air around his outstretched hand. A second passed. Then two. Then Maverick lowered his head slightly. Just slightly. A nod. It wasn't submission. It wasn't permission. It was recognition. Ethan felt something behind his ribs unwind. He exhaled. The dog returned to the girl. Not between them now, but beside her. She still hadn't moved. but her eyes had changed. A crack had opened. He knelt lower now, lowering himself to the child's eye level. "My name's Ethan," he said softly. "I live just a few miles from here. I saw your tracks." He paused, realizing she hadn't reacted. Then he noticed the stillness of her ears, the way her body flinched when a tree branch cracked in the wind, but not when he spoke. She couldn't hear him, not even a little. He swallowed the knot rising in his throat. He pointed to himself, tapped his chest. "Ethan," then pointed at her. She blinked, didn't respond. That was okay. He pointed at Maverick, then looked at the dog. The girl looked too. "Good dog," Ethan said. Maverick didn't move. "But Amy..." Her lips twitched, just for a moment. Not a smile, not yet, but something. He reached into his coat slowly, pulled out a wool scarf, warm, thick, dry. He placed it on the snow between them. No sudden movements, just kindness. She didn't take it, but she looked at it, and that was enough. Ethan stood, backed away one step, then two. "Come with me," he said gently, not expecting her to hear it. "You don't have to. But if you do, I've got a fire going. And food." His breath trembled, but not from cold. He turned. He didn't expect them to follow, not immediately. So when he heard a shuffle behind him, he didn't smile. He just breathed again. Behind him, Amy stood, scarf in hand. And beside her, Maverick followed. Eyes on the man, always watching. But no longer guarding her from him. Now, guarding her with him. The cabin stood like a scar against the snow, weather-worn, isolated, and somehow still standing just like its owner. Ethan pushed open the heavy wooden door with his shoulder and stepped inside the draft, curling inward like a long exhale of the forest. The warmth hit instantly, thick and dry from the stone hearth crackling in the far corner. Smoke spiraled up the chimney in lazy coils, pine-sweet and memory-laced. He held the door for her. Amy stood on the threshold, small and unmoving. Her eyes swept the room the way someone inspects a place that might trap them, not save them. One hand was curled tightly around Maverick's fur. The other held the scarf Ethan had given her earlier, now worn like a shield around her neck. She didn't step inside until the dog did first. Maverick limped slightly, something Ethan hadn't noticed in the rush of adrenaline earlier. The back right leg, not broken, but favoring. "Damn," Ethan muttered under his breath. He didn't reach for the girl. He didn't speak again. Instead, he moved across the room slowly and stoked the fire, opening it just enough to feed in a split log from the basket. The flames jumped, casting gold light across the floor. The moment they did, Amy flinched. She didn't scream, didn't bolt, but she moved abruptly back toward the door. Ethan saw it, and he froze. She was staring at the fire wide-eyed, as if it were something alive. Maverick didn't move either. Ethan rose slowly, walked to a shelf, took down a battery lantern and switched it on. Soft amber glow. He doused the fire. Not entirely, just enough that it calmed. He set the lantern on the floor. Then kneeling, he made a sweeping motion toward the couch, an invitation, not a demand. Amy hesitated, but Maverick moved forward and lay on the rug beside the hearth body, curling in toward the heat. She followed. Ethan let her be. He turned to gather supplies, clean towels, antiseptic, a pair of oversized wool socks. The dog came first. He knelt beside Maverick, gently lifting the paw. A gash across the pad, deep but not dangerous. Likely from a steel jaw trap. Bastards still set them out here, illegal or not. He cleaned it quietly, murmuring half-formed apologies. Maverick winced, but didn't pull away. Amy watched every move, not like a child watching a vet. Like a soldier watching someone handle a weapon near a friend. Her eyes didn't soften until Ethan wrapped the paw and gave it a light pat. "There, you'll still outrun me." He looked over. Amy blinked once, then looked away. He set the medical kit down and walked to the kitchen. Opened the small propane fridge. Dug out a carton of yogurt and a granola bar. Nothing fancy, but it was food. He placed it near the girl, then backed away. No words, just proximity. She reached for the yogurt first. Her hands trembled. She didn't eat fast, but she didn't stop either. Ethan exhaled slowly and sat down across the room near the old rocking chair his wife used to love. He watched her, not in the way people study strays or mysteries. In the way someone studies pain, recognizes it, and chooses not to touch it until it speaks first. The silence between them stretched, the kind of silence that has gravity. Then when she finished, she set the spoon aside carefully, as if it might shatter. Her fingers brushed her coat pocket. Something crinkled. Ethan's eyes caught it. Amy stiffened. He raised a hand just enough to ask for permission. She hesitated. Then slowly she pulled out the paper, folded, damp, wrinkled into itself like it knew shame. She handed it to him without looking at his face. He took it carefully, opened it. The ink had bled, but the words were still legible. "Please don't look for us. She's better off gone." Time stopped, not because the words were shocking, but because they were familiar. Ethan had heard different versions of that sentence in rescue missions, in body recoveries, in half-told stories left behind by those too tired to carry guilt. But never had they been written about a child. A girl this small, this silent, this utterly alone. He looked at Amy. She was staring at the floor, her arms wrapped around her knees again, her back to the firelight, her profile sharp in the lantern glow. He folded the note, set it gently on the table beside him, and didn't say a word. But something inside him cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but deeply. He stood, walked toward the window, looked out over the ridge, his reflection a ghost in the glass. He had a daughter once, not in body, not in name, but in dreams, in the plans he and Claire had made in quiet hours. The ones where they'd talked about names, about tiny socks on drying lines, about lullabies and school buses. It never happened. Claire was taken before it could, but the grief never left. It lived inside his ribs like an organ, familiar, heavy, permanent. And now across the room sat a little girl who didn't ask for anything. Not food, not warmth, not even her name spoken aloud. But something in her, the way she curled in corners, the way she clung to the dog like it was the last truth left, screamed louder than any voice. He turned back. She was looking at him now, not afraid, just waiting. He sat down again, close but not too close, and nodded, not to comfort, to acknowledge. He didn't know who she was. He didn't know who had left her. But he knew in that moment, with a certainty so cold, it burned, that she was not going back. Not to whoever wrote that note, not to whatever silence had swallowed her before, not while he was alive. It was still early when Ethan opened the front door and saw it. A metal tin, small, rusted at the corners, sitting alone on the porch, right where no one could miss it, but where no one should have reached. He froze. The morning snow was unbroken around it. No footprints, no tire marks. Just that tin sitting on aged wood like it had grown there. Like it belonged. It didn't. Maverick pushed past his leg and stepped onto the porch, nose flaring, hackles rising. He didn't bark, but his body shifted, tense alert muscles vibrating beneath his fur. Ethan scanned the tree line. Nothing. He crouched, grabbed the tin carefully, as if it might bite. Back inside, he set it on the kitchen table and opened it without a word. Inside, the smell of old paper and cold metal. He pulled out the contents one by one. Photographs, crisp, printed on thick paper. Not casual snapshots, these were surveillance grade. Black and white long lens. Amy standing beside a rusted swing set. Amy climbing into a van. Amy asleep in the back seat, cheek pressed to the window, unaware of the eye watching her. Ethan's hands tightened around the edges. Then a folded note. No signature, just 5 words. She was never meant to live. Silence fell over the room like snow on stone. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't have to. Across the cabin, Maverick had positioned himself in front of the couch between Amy and the door. His ears were flat. His chest rose and fell in shallow bursts. Amy was still asleep. Her small body curled beneath the quilt fingers buried in the dog's fur. Ethan stared at her for a long time. Then he walked to the radio. The static came instantly. White noise laced with distance. He adjusted the frequency, tapped the side, leaned in. Jackson Dispatch, this is Ranger Ethan Walsh. Come in. Crackling, then a faint voice. Go ahead, Ranger Walsh. I need to report a possible threat to a minor. I have a child in my custody, approximate age 6. No name, no ID. Found during patrol near Ridge Creek. There's been a development. Pause. Is she listed as missing? That's the thing. She's not listed at all. Ethan glanced back at the tin. At the photo on top, Amy caught mid-step, completely unaware of being watched. Nothing on the state system, he asked. We ran facial scans this morning, the dispatcher replied. Nothing. No matches. Not from Montana, not from out of state. It's like she was never entered. Ethan's voice dropped. That's not possible. The dispatcher hesitated. You said she couldn't speak. She's deaf, possibly selective mute. But she's communicative. And she trusts the dog. That's more than I've seen in years. More static. Then, do you want to bring her in? Ethan looked at the girl again. At how she held Maverick's paw like an anchor. No, he said finally. Not yet. Another pause. Understood. Keep us updated, Ranger Walsh. He set the radio down and walked back to the tin. Packed everything back in, carefully sealing it like something radioactive. He didn't say anything when Amy stirred. Didn't mention the photos or the message. But Maverick didn't lie back down. He stayed upright like a soldier at attention. Every sound outside, branches cracking, snow falling from the roof, triggered a twitch in his body. A low, constant growl settled in his chest, never loud, but ever present. Amy didn't ask what was wrong, but she sensed it. She stayed close to the dog. Even when Ethan placed a bowl of warm oatmeal in front of her, she didn't eat until Maverick took the first bite from his own dish. That evening, Ethan sat at the table long after the girl had curled back into sleep. He stared at the tin again, then at the map on the wall. Red lines marked familiar patrol routes. Green pins for supply points, and now a black pin. He pressed it into the wood near Ridge Creek, the point where he'd found her, a shadow on his doorstep. She wasn't lost. She had been abandoned. She wasn't forgotten. She'd been erased. And now whoever had done it knew exactly where she was. Maverick stood beside him, tail still gaze unwavering. "You feel it too," Ethan whispered. The dog didn't blink. Ethan turned toward the couch. Amy slept soundly, but her body curled inward. Not relaxed, guarded. Even in dreams, she prepared for retreat. Ethan's jaw clenched. He walked to the closet, pulled out the old duffel bag he hadn't touched in years, laid it on the table, and unzipped it. Inside, a flare gun, a compass, a revolver with 3 bullets left, emergency blankets, a satellite phone with a dead battery. He pulled out the revolver, checked it, loaded. Then he looked at Maverick. "We're not hiding," he said. The dog stepped forward, stood beside him. They didn't speak the same language, but the pact was clear. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The snow hadn't stopped in days, but inside the cabin, warmth had returned not just in temperature, but in something quieter, thicker. The kind of warmth that builds when silence becomes comfort instead of absence. Ethan watched from across the table as Amy traced her finger along the wood-grain brow, furrowed in concentration. She was focused, tongue-poking from the corner of her mouth, in that serious, determined way that children sometimes inherit from no one and everyone all at once. He held up 2 fingers, then twisted his hand in a smooth motion, forming the sign again. "Family." Amy blinked, studying his hands, then looked up at him, her own fingers mirroring the shape. Slower, tentative, but clear. He nodded once, smiling just enough to soften the room. She didn't smile back, but her fingers repeated the sign again, this time smoother, like it belonged to her now. "Good," he said softly. She couldn't hear him, but he said it anyway. Maverick lay curled at her feet, his ears twitching, his eyes half-lidded. When Amy dropped her hands and leaned slightly against his side, the dog exhaled a sound that was almost contentment. Almost. The learning had started 3 days before with Ethan sketching letters into the frost on the window pane. A for Amy, E for Ethan, M for Maverick. Amy had watched fascinated, not because the letters meant much, but because someone was drawing something for her, not at her. Then came the gestures, finger to chest for me, open palm for safe. Slowly, the invisible walls between them thinned until gestures turned to meaning, and meaning turned to language. Not perfect, not fluent, but theirs. She learned quickly, not because she wanted to, because she needed to. Ethan noticed she flinched at certain things. The creak of the stairs, the slamming of cupboard doors, sudden shadows in the window. But most of all, closed doors. She wouldn't sleep in the back room, even when he laid out a proper bed for her. Instead, she'd curl up on the couch under blankets, always within arm's reach of Maverick. The dog seemed to understand. Every night, as her eyes began to flutter, he would rise, pad to her side, and lie with his head across her legs. And when she dreamed, and the shaking started, he would lick her hand gently, just once, until her breathing steadied. Ethan never spoke of it, but he saw, every time. He spent one long afternoon in the workshop behind the cabin, shaping a small block of cedar with a knife dulled by years of neglect. His hands were slow, the cuts rough at first, but he wasn't aiming for beauty. He was building a promise. When he finished, he held it in his palm, a simple wooden bracelet. No polish, just raw edges and a single word carved into the underside. Home. That night, he gave it to her without ceremony, just laid it on the table and gestured. Her eyes widened. She picked it up with both hands, turned it over, and ran her fingers along the letters. She didn't sign anything, didn't gesture thanks, but she didn't take it off after that, not even when she slept. The storm outside had grown worse, but inside routine had formed. Ethan cooked, Amy learned. Maverick guarded. Sometimes Ethan caught himself humming again, a tune Claire used to play on the piano. Something soft, lilting, impossible to name, but easy to remember. One evening, Amy signed a question. Dog's name. Ethan smiled. He knelt beside Maverick, scratched behind the ears, and pointed. Maverick. Amy repeated the sign with exaggerated seriousness, then nodded satisfied. Later, she asked for the word safe, then stay. Then after a pause, she signed. Mine. Ethan felt that knot in his chest again, the one that had been unraveling since the moment he found her. He nodded. Yes, he said aloud, signing with it. Yours. It happened on a Tuesday morning just before dawn. The snow was falling slower now, the light outside pale and blue. Amy stood by the window, blanket draped over her shoulders like a cape. She didn't move for a long time. Then without turning, she signed 3 words. Ethan, sitting at the table behind her, caught them in the reflection of the glass. Man, outside now. He stood instantly, walked slowly toward the window. There were no footprints, no sounds. But Maverick was already up, standing in front of Amy, body low, growl low in his chest. Ethan opened the door a crack. Cold air spilled in. He stepped out, scanned the tree line. Nothing. But the feeling, that familiar throat-tightening instinct, it was there again. They weren't alone. Inside, Ethan closed the door gently. He knelt before Amy. You saw someone, he signed. She nodded once. Small, sharp, big, watching. He didn't question it, didn't doubt. He turned to the cabinet, pulled out the revolver, and loaded it quietly. Amy didn't flinch. She simply sat down beside Maverick and reached for his paw. The bracelet on her wrist caught the firelight. Home. She touched it once and waited. It began with a creak. Not from the wood settling or the wind shifting snow off the roof, but something deliberate. Something heavy. Ethan's eyes snapped open. The fire had died down to glowing embers, casting only the softest halo across the cabin floor. Outside, the storm had quieted. Too quiet. The kind of silence that suffocates rather than soothes. He moved without sound, slipping from the armchair and crossing the room in practiced steps. Maverick was already up, already tense ears, rigid teeth just barely showing. Amy slept on the couch, curled tight under a blanket. Her fingers still grasped the edge of Maverick's tail. She didn't stir. Then glass shattered. A window on the far side, small bathroom level. The sound was sharp, clean. It wasn't meant to alert. It was meant to open. Ethan grabbed the revolver from the drawer beneath the sink, cocked the hammer back, and crouched low. He made eye contact with Maverick, who growled once, a sound like thunder behind a locked door. The second sound came fast. Boots! Inside. Ethan moved toward the hallway. A shadow flickered near the back, too tall to be Amy, too controlled to be afraid. He raised the gun. Stop right there. A figure lunged from the dark. Maverick was faster. The dog launched from the side, hitting the intruder at full speed. They crashed against the wall with a grunt and a curse. A knife clattered across the floor. Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired, not to kill. A single warning shot aimed just above the man's shoulder into the wall. Wood splintered. Get out, he shouted. Now. Two more shadows bolted from the hallway, scrambling toward the front door. Ethan fired again into the ceiling this time. The sound cracked like lightning. Maverick held his ground, snarling fangs bared. The attacker beneath him kicked free and stumbled backward, hand bleeding from the dog's bite. He didn't fight back. He ran. They all did. Gone in seconds. The door slammed open. Footsteps vanished into snow. Ethan moved to follow, gun raised, but then he smelled it. Smoke, not from the hearth. From the back. He turned. A thick, acrid scent rolled in from the small bathroom window. Then flames. They'd tossed something in before leaving. An accelerant. He hadn't seen it, hadn't heard it drop. But now the wall was catching. Fast. He bolted into the kitchen, grabbed the fire extinguisher, and doused the blaze as best he could. Foam hissed. Steam rose. The fire hissed like a wounded animal, but refused to die. It was too late for the back half of the house. He turned toward the front. Amy was awake. She hadn't made a sound, but she was sitting upright, eyes wide, shaking violently. Maverick was beside her, licking her hand, trying to keep her grounded. The smoke was curling under the beams now, thick, black. Ethan didn't waste time. He ran to her, scooped her up in both arms, and yelled over his shoulder, Maverick, let's go. The dog obeyed instantly. They burst through the front door and into the snow. Cold air hit like knives, but it was clean. Real. Alive. Ethan ran them down the slope to the tree line. Only when they reached the base of the ridge did he stop. Amy was clinging to him, silent, but the sobs tore through her body like convulsions. She wasn't crying with sound, just breath, just movement. It was more violent than any scream. Ethan collapsed to his knees and held her tighter. You're okay, he whispered. You're safe. But even as he said it, he looked back toward the cabin and knew it wasn't true. Flames licked the edges of the back wall, now devouring insulation and timber. The roof above the bathroom sagged, threatening collapse. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a bluff. It was a message. They didn't want her back. They wanted her gone. For good. Maverick stood beside them, growling, low body positioned between Ethan and the burning house, as if the fire could reach from there and strike again. Amy's tears had stopped, but her eyes were still wide, still lost. Ethan brushed soot from her cheek, leaned in close, and signed one word with a shaking hand. Safe. Amy didn't move, didn't answer, just looked at him. Then slowly she raised her hand and signed back. Not anymore. And Ethan knew she was right. The forest smoldered behind them. What remained of the cabin was still upright, barely the walls blackened with smoke windows, cracked roof sagging in a way that made it look more like a broken promise than a home. They didn't go far. Ethan led Amy and Maverick to the old ranger outpost a quarter-mile down the slope, a shelter built into the rock years ago. He hadn't used it since Claire died. But tonight the lock still turned, and the air inside still smelled like pine and gun oil. Amy curled into Maverick's side on the cot without a word. She hadn't signed anything since the fire. Ethan didn't blame her. He sat at the metal desk in the corner with the tin. The one left on the porch days before. The one that had set everything into motion. The photographs were still inside. The note, too. But now, in the flicker of a lantern, something else caught his attention. A thin slit in the lining. He hadn't noticed it before, too distracted by the threat, by the heat of the moment. But now, he slid a pocket knife along the seam. It peeled back with a soft crackle like the edge of a wound reopening. Inside a flash drive, unlabeled, cold to the touch. Ethan inserted it into the old laptop he kept for reports. No internet, just files, documents, maps. The screen flickered. A folder opened. One file, no name, just a timestamp Evan 419 MP4. He clicked it. The video was grainy at first. Shot at night, a warehouse maybe. Shadows moving, voices too far away to make out. Then the frame shifted, stabilized. A man stepped into the camera's view, dragging something. A crate, no, a cage. Inside was a child, face pressed to the bars, silent. Amy, but younger, no more than 4. Her eyes met the camera directly, not with fear, with understanding, as if she knew what the camera was. Who was behind it? And what it meant to be seen. Ethan's stomach turned. He fast-forwarded. Another cut, a room with a table, 2 men, paperwork. A third man handed over a stack of bills. The camera panned back to the child, Amy, now wearing a different shirt. Her hair was cut short, her face expressionless, like she'd done this before, like this was normal. Ethan's jaw tightened. The final shot was quick, blurry. A face entered the frame for only half a second. A man, mid-40s, thin, sharp features, dark hair. He glanced toward the camera, scowled, said something unintelligible, then black. Ethan sat frozen for a moment. His fingers trembled slightly as he closed the lid of the laptop. He looked across the room at Amy. Her body was still, chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. She hadn't seen the video. He didn't want her to. Not yet. Not ever if he could help it. Maverick stirred beside her, and something clicked. The dog had seen that place. That man. That cage. Ethan rose, crossed to the shelf, pulled out an old box from his time in Montana search and rescue. He dug through files, case reports, old mission briefings. Dust scattered with each flip. Then he found it. Operation Gray Wind, March 2020. Cross-agency manhunt into human trafficking across 3 states. A compound in Idaho. Raided. Records destroyed in a fire. No survivors, except one. K9 Unit Bravo 6. Call sign Maverick. Handler killed in the blaze. Dog presumed dead 2 weeks later after going missing in transport. Ethan dropped the folder on the table. Maverick stood now, eyes locked on him. "You were there," Ethan whispered. The dog didn't blink. "You remember her?" Maverick stepped forward slowly, then placed one paw on the edge of the desk. His nails tapped the surface once. Not an accident. Confirmation. Everything fell into place at once. Amy hadn't just been trafficked. She'd escaped. Somehow. Some way. And Maverick that day in the snow hadn't just stumbled onto a child in need. He'd found her again, after all these years, because she'd been the one piece left behind. The ghost they hadn't erased. The one memory Maverick had buried beneath instinct and ice. And now, she was the one thing they still feared, because she remembered too, because she was proof. Ethan exhaled, steadying himself. He picked up the flash drive again, turned it over. Thought about the face in the video. The cage. The silence. And the message? She was never meant to live. This wasn't about running anymore. It was about exposing everything they'd buried. He crossed to the cot, knelt beside Amy, and tapped the wooden bracelet on her wrist. She stirred, looked at him through half-lidded eyes. He signed one word. "Truth." She hesitated, then nodded. Just once. And from the floor, Maverick growled, not in warning. In agreement, they left before dawn. The cold was razor-sharp, the kind that didn't simply chill, but tried to peel the skin back from the bone. Snow hissed beneath their boots, hard-packed and crusted with ice. The ranger outpost disappeared behind them, swallowed by trees that loomed like dark sentinels in the blue-gray morning. Ethan carried the revolver in one coat pocket and the USB in the other. One was for protection, the other for truth. Amy clung tightly to Maverick's collar as they walked. She didn't ask questions. She didn't sign a single word. But her eyes never left the dog's back, as if watching his shoulders was the only map she trusted now. They were heading south toward the boundary of the protected wilderness, where Ethan knew a rescue station still stood. It was old, isolated, and mostly used by helicopter patrols in the summer. But it had a radio and solar power. If they could reach it, someone would hear them. They were 3 miles in when Ethan saw the tracks. He stopped abruptly. Amy bumped into his leg and looked up. Boot prints, 4 sets. Fresh. He scanned the ridge ahead, the natural choke point before the trail opened into the lower basin. Dense evergreens flanked both sides, narrowing into a snowy funnel. He knew it too well. There was no way out the other side without walking straight into whoever was waiting. They were boxed in. He turned to Amy, knelt. She didn't need him to explain. Her hands tightened on Maverick's fur. Then Maverick growled, low, steady, focused like a wire pulled tight. Ethan turned just in time to see a glint of light on metal far off between trees. A scope. "Move," Ethan whispered. "Now." They doubled back, ducking behind a fallen log, climbing up a slope that ran parallel to the ridge. Ethan knew there was another way, an old wildlife path that veered east, barely visible when snow covered it. But it would skirt the outer rim of the cliffs. Dangerous, narrow, but unguarded. Maverick moved, first nose down, tail rigid, guiding them along the edge. Branches clawed at their faces. Rocks shifted beneath their steps. One misstep, and they'd fall 100 feet. Amy never cried. She never even whimpered. Ethan glanced back once and saw her expression, not afraid, just locked in. She was surviving. Then it happened. A rusted snare trap, likely left by poachers, was hidden beneath the snow. Maverick stepped into it. The snap echoed like a shot. He yelped a raw, terrible sound. Amy turned instantly, dropping to her knees beside him. The steel clamp had caught his front leg. Blood already staining the snow. Ethan dropped to the ground, pried the trap open with shaking hands. Maverick thrashed once, then stilled, letting Ethan work. The leg was torn, deep. He wrapped it fast with gauze from his kit, knowing it wouldn't hold long. Maverick tried to stand. Stumbled. Amy held his head, whispering something Ethan couldn't hear, rocking back and forth. The sound of footsteps on snow snapped them all back to the moment. They were close now. Ethan stood body tense. "You have to go," he told Maverick. The dog growled as if to argue. Ethan looked at Amy. She was signing something, repeating it, over and over. "He's hurt." Ethan knelt beside her. "We go. He comes later." She shook her head, eyes wide, shimmering. Then Maverick did something Ethan would never forget. He stood, on 3 legs, one paw tucked up the wrapped leg, bleeding through. He looked at Ethan, then ahead, and started walking. One step, then another, opening a path, leading them forward. They followed. The ridge narrowed again. Trees gave way to an open flatland, a basin carved by ancient glaciers. In summer it would be full of wildflowers. Now it was white, endless. They were halfway across when the first shot rang out. Snow exploded at Ethan's feet. He shoved Amy down, covered her body with his own. Another shot. Closer. Then voices. "Get up." Ethan stood slowly, revolver raised. Across the basin, 4 figures, guns drawn, faces covered. One of them stepped forward. The same one from the video. The man with the sharp features and colder eyes. "We just want the girl," he shouted. Amy clung to Maverick, fingers tangled in fur. Ethan aimed. "You're not getting her." The man shrugged. "It's not personal." "Yeah," Ethan said. "It is now." Another shot cracked, this time aimed high, a warning. They started closing in. Ethan turned to Amy. "Run!" She didn't move. He looked at Maverick. "Take her!" Maverick tried to move. Collapsed, leg giving out beneath him. Amy dropped to her knees, wrapped her arms around his neck. The men kept coming. Ethan fired once. Missed. They fanned out. One of them raised his weapon, aimed straight for Amy. Then Maverick stood, broken, bleeding, but standing. And then he ran. Straight at them. No bark. No hesitation. He hit the gunman square in the chest, teeth sinking deep into flesh. The man screamed, dropped his weapon. Chaos erupted. Ethan fired again. This time he hit one in the leg. The man dropped. Another rushed forward. Ethan tackled him. They rolled in the snow, fists, flying gun kicked aside. The man was bigger, stronger, but Ethan fought like a father with something to lose. He slammed the man's head into the ice. Once, twice. The body went still. He looked up. Maverick was down. Shot. Amy was screaming, but only in silence. Her mouth open. No sound. Just pain. She crawled to him, hands on his fur face pressed to his chest. He was still breathing. Barely. Ethan staggered to his feet, revolver in hand. 2 more rounds. One for the man still crawling toward the gun. One for the man who tried to reach Amy. Silence returned, except for Amy's breath, sharp and broken. Ethan knelt beside Maverick. The dog looked at him, one eye half closed, chest rising faintly. Ethan didn't speak. He just laid a hand on Maverick's head. And Maverick one last time licked Amy's hand, then stilled. Amy buried her face into his fur. Ethan looked away, not out of shame, but because grief had no words left. The snow began falling again. Soft. Relentless. Like the world was trying to cover what it couldn't explain. Ethan sat in the basin, knees in the snow, arms wrapped around Amy. She didn't shake, didn't blink. She just lay in his lap, cradled against his chest, her hand resting gently on Maverick's still body. His fur was wet with blood and snow and salt. The silence was the kind that comes after something sacred has broken. Not shattered, just stopped. Ethan couldn't speak. He had nothing left inside him but the aching throb of loss, familiar, yet different this time. Not like when Claire died. That had been quiet, distant something he watched helplessly as it slipped away. This was raw, brutal, earned, and irreversible. Maverick was gone. Not in a flash, not in a blaze. He had stayed until the end, until they were safe. Amy hadn't cried, not once. But now, as Ethan rocked her gently, she lifted her head, stared at Maverick with eyes wider than the world should ever allow a child to bear. And then her lips moved. At first it was a whisper lost in the wind, then stronger, fragile, fractured, but real. "He saved me," she said. Ethan blinked. He looked at her, not shocked, not awed, just humbled. The voice of a girl who had never used sound to communicate. But now for him. For Maverick. She did. The sound of snowmobiles in the distance broke the quiet. Too late. Always too late. Lights flickered through the trees. Red, blue, flashing through fog. A voice on a megaphone called out names Ethan didn't recognize. Protocol. Perimeter. Then officers appeared, armed, armored, cautious. They didn't fire. Didn't ask questions right away. Just stared at the scene. One man on his knees holding a child. A dog lying still, surrounded by blood and footprints. And a handful of bodies strewn like ghosts across the clearing. Ethan didn't move as they approached. One officer dropped to his side. "Are you Ethan Walsh?" He nodded slowly. "Where's the girl?" "She's here." "Is she hurt?" "No," Ethan whispered. "Not anymore." A second officer knelt, checked Maverick's pulse out of habit. His fingers stilled. "I'm sorry." Ethan didn't reply. Amy stared at the officer's badge, then looked back down at Maverick. She ran her fingers along his side lips, trembling. One of the officers stepped back and made a call. Medical, maybe. Reinforcements. But the urgency had already passed. Another stood over one of the attackers, then shook his head. Nothing. No ID, no phone, no prints in the system. They checked the others. Same result. The man Ethan had tackled near the ridge had vanished, dragged away, or crawled off bleeding. No witnesses, no names, no trail. It would become just another unsolved entry, another sealed folder on someone's desk. Ethan handed the flash drive to the officer. "This is all that's left." They took it, but something in their eyes said they didn't believe it would matter, and maybe it wouldn't. Evidence disappears. People vanish. Stories are rewritten by those who write the reports. But truth lives elsewhere. In memory, in scars, in the spaces where love dies, but still chooses to stay. Hours passed before they moved the bodies, before they asked the questions, before Ethan and Amy were taken to the edge of the mountain for extraction. They refused to leave Maverick behind. Two men built a sled out of canvas and poles. They wrapped him gently. Ethan walked beside it the whole way down. Amy never let go of his tail until the last knot was tied. Later, in a government building in Helena, Ethan sat in a cold chair while a man in a suit asked him about timelines, threats, motivations. He answered with what he could. Most of it didn't make it into the report. The flash drive disappeared into an evidence locker. The folder was sealed, classified, closed. They ruled the intruders as unknown militia. No ties to trafficking, no clear objective. No arrests were made. Case dismissed. He knew it would be. Amy stayed with him. There were inquiries, of course, background checks, foster discussions. But she didn't want to leave, and he didn't ask her to. She began to speak little by little, only when it mattered. She signed more than she said, but when she said it, it always cut deep. Sometimes she sat on the porch and whispered into the wind, as if Maverick were still out there, listening. The snow had returned, not the bitter, suffocating kind from before. This time it came soft, like a hush over the earth. Gentle enough to coat rooftops, subtle enough to let people forget the storms that came before it. Ethan stood by the window of their small house on the edge of a quiet Montana town. Morning light spilled across the floor, illuminating a space that smelled like cedar cinnamon and something warm. Alive. Amy's laughter echoed from the next room. Not loud, but real. Her voice was still cautious, like stepping on a frozen lake that might crack beneath you, but she used it more now. And when she didn't, her hands danced through the air with a fluency that stunned Ethan every time. Language, after all, had never truly been her barrier. Pain was, but that was changing. The school they found was small, nestled between a library and a bakery. A special program for children with hearing impairments. Teachers who signed every sentence, classmates who didn't look at Amy like she was missing something, but like she already knew things the rest of them were still learning. She came home that first day beaming, signed friend, and later that week after dinner whispered to Ethan across the table, "They don't think I'm broken." He almost choked on his coffee, then simply nodded. "You never were." He rebuilt everything with his hands, not because he had to, because he needed to. Each table leg, each cabinet handle, each window frame was shaped with care, as if trying to hold the future together with something tangible, something real. He let Amy help. She painted drawers with streaks of color he didn't have the heart to correct. One cabinet door still squeaked. He didn't fix it. It reminded him of Maverick's nails on the old wooden floor, subtle, steady, always nearby. They didn't speak about the men from the mountains. Not directly. Amy would sometimes flinch when certain boots stepped too loud, or when a stranger brushed too close in the grocery store. But she always had her hand on the wooden bracelet. Still wore it every day. Home, it read. On the living room wall above the fireplace was a new carving. He'd spent weeks on it. A wooden portrait burned into maple Maverick, mid-turn, ears perked, looking into the forest. Not back at them, but forward, as if still on watch, as if still leading them somewhere. Amy had helped stain the wood. Her small fingerprints forever sealed beneath the surface. One morning, while dusting the bookshelf, Ethan found something tucked between two field journals. It was a folded piece of paper. Worn, frayed. The one they'd found in Amy's pocket all those months ago. Please don't come looking for us." He sat down and stared at it for a long time, then tore it in half, then in half again, and tossed it into the fire. Some ghosts didn't need to be hunted, just released. The snow continued to fall that afternoon. Amy built a crooked snowman in the yard, gave it one eye a scarf and what looked suspiciously like a piece of bacon for a mouth. She signed a story to it as she worked something about a lost mountain dragon and a girl who taught it how to sing. Ethan watched from the porch, coffee steaming in his hand. He smiled. When she finished, she looked at him. "Signed you okay?" He nodded. "Signed back better, because of you." She didn't respond in signs. She ran to him, arms out, face red from cold, hugged his waist tight. Didn't let go for a long time. That night, snow piled up in clean waves along the windowsills. The house was quiet, except for the ticking of a wall clock and the occasional snap of wood in the fireplace. Ethan sat alone for a while after Amy had gone to bed. He stared at the fire, at the way it danced without apology. He thought of Claire, of Maverick, of that first night, the white void, the wind, the fear, and how somehow, from all of it, they had found something worth staying for. He stood up, walked to the door, opened it. Snowflakes spiraled under the porch light, slow and weightless. He looked down. In the unbroken snow, one small footprint. Right beside it, a paw print. Still visible, still there, fading but not forgotten. He whispered into the cold. Not all miracles leave light. A pause, then quieter. Sometimes, it's just a footprint in the snow.